And listen to this, because what happened during that conversation surprised your soulmate more than anyone else. They entered the discussion expecting it to remain casual, expecting it to stay within the boundaries of ordinary topics. There was no intention to revisit old emotions. There was no plan to explore feelings they had spent so much time keeping under control. Yet as the conversation unfolded, something unexpected happened. Certain questions were asked, certain observations were made, and before they realized it, thoughts they usually kept hidden began moving closer to the surface. At first, they were careful. They chose their words cautiously. They answered only what was necessary. Whenever the conversation drifted toward personal matters, they tried to redirect it. But emotions have a strange way of revealing themselves when we least expect it. The more honest the discussion became, the more difficult it was to maintain the emotional distance they had worked so hard to create. Small comments carried more meaning than intended. Certain reactions appeared too quickly to hide. Even moments of silence seemed to reveal things they were not saying out loud. What made this experience so powerful was that nobody was forcing them to confess anything. Nobody was demanding explanations. Yet the conversation created a space where avoiding the truth suddenly felt more difficult than acknowledging it. As they listened and responded, they became increasingly aware of feelings they thought were neatly organized and safely tucked away. Feelings they believed they had already understood. Feelings they assumed no longer carried the same weight. Yet every new topic seemed to uncover another layer they had not fully examined. And listen to this, because this is where they started noticing something they could no longer ignore. Whenever your connection was indirectly referenced, their emotional response changed. Certain memories immediately came to mind. Certain feelings appeared without invitation. What surprised them most was not the memories themselves. It was the intensity behind them. Time was supposed to soften things. Distance was supposed to make everything easier to categorize. Yet the emotions remained remarkably present, as though part of them had been waiting for permission to finally speak. The more the conversation continued, the more they found themselves reflecting instead of responding automatically. They stopped relying on the explanations they had repeated to themselves for so long. They stopped using logic as a shield. For the first time in a very long while, they allowed themselves to honestly examine what was happening inside them. And what they discovered was both uncomfortable and enlightening. Beneath all the practical reasons, beneath all the efforts to move forward, beneath all the stories they told themselves, there were still feelings connected to you that had never fully disappeared. This realization did not arrive dramatically. It appeared gradually through a series of small moments, a hesitation before answering a question, a memory that surfaced unexpectedly, an emotional reaction that felt stronger than it should have. Piece by piece, the conversation exposed truths they had not intended to discuss. And the more those truths emerged, the harder it became to pretend they were insignificant. What unsettled them most was realizing how much energy they had spent trying to keep these emotions hidden even from themselves. They had convinced themselves that silence was the same thing as resolution. They believed that avoiding certain thoughts meant they no longer mattered. But this conversation revealed something entirely different. It revealed that feelings can remain alive beneath the surface long after we stop talking about them. By the time the discussion was nearing its end, your soulmate understood something important. The emotions they had been trying to control were not as distant as they once believed. In fact, they were far closer than they had ever been willing to admit. And as that realization settled into their heart, they found themselves facing a truth that would become impossible to ignore. The more honest the conversation became, the clearer it was that their heart had been carrying something significant for much longer than they realized. And listen to this, because after that conversation ended, your soulmate could not stop thinking about one question. Why had they worked so hard to keep those feelings hidden in the first place? The discussion was over, the words had already been spoken, and yet their mind kept returning to the same realization. The emotions that surfaced during that conversation were not new. They had been there all along. The only difference was that now they could no longer pretend not to see them. For a long time, they convinced themselves that keeping those feelings buried was the sensible thing to do. It felt safer. It felt easier. Acknowledging certain emotions would have required vulnerability, and vulnerability was something they spent years trying to avoid. As long as those feelings remained hidden, they could maintain control. They could focus on practical matters. They could tell themselves they had moved on. They could avoid difficult questions that did not have simple answers. At first, they believed time would solve everything. They assumed that enough distance would naturally weaken the connection. They thought life would eventually create enough distractions to make those emotions disappear on their own. But what they failed to realize was that some feelings do not vanish simply because they are ignored. Sometimes they become quieter, but they remain present beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves again. And listen to this, because this is what the conversation forced them to confront. Every reason they used to suppress their emotions suddenly seemed less convincing. They realized that many of those reasons were not based on certainty at all. They were based on fear. Fear of being disappointed, fear of facing uncertainty, fear of discovering that the connection still held significance. Most of all, fear of admitting that certain emotions had remained with them far longer than they ever intended. The more they reflected, the clearer this became. They had spent years protecting themselves from possibilities. Instead of exploring what they truly felt, they focused on convincing themselves why those feelings should not matter. Instead of listening to their heart, they listened to every argument that encouraged emotional distance. Yet despite all those efforts, the emotions remained. Not because they were stubborn, not because they refused to move forward, but because they represented something important that had never been fully acknowledged. What surprised them most was realizing how exhausting this emotional resistance had become. Keeping feelings hidden requires energy. Pretending not to care requires energy. Constantly explaining away emotions requires energy. They had been carrying that burden for much longer than they realized. The conversation exposed that burden in a way they could no longer ignore. It showed them how much effort had gone into maintaining a version of reality that never completely matched what they felt inside. As these realizations continued unfolding, they began seeing the connection from a different perspective. Instead of viewing their emotions as something they needed to suppress, they started viewing them as something they needed to understand. That shift changed everything. For the first time, they stopped asking how to hide the feelings and started asking why those feelings remained so persistent. The answer was becoming increasingly obvious. The connection had left a deeper impact than they ever admitted. It had shaped their thoughts, influenced their growth, and remained present in ways they could no longer dismiss. And listen to this, because this is where a powerful truth finally emerged. Hiding the feelings may have protected them from discomfort temporarily, but it never removed the emotions themselves. It only delayed the moment when they would have to face them honestly. Now, after everything revealed during that conversation, they were beginning to understand that avoidance had never been the solution. The truth had simply been waiting patiently beneath the surface, and for the first time, they were ready to see it clearly. What they discovered next would change the way they understood the connection forever. And listen to this, because after spending so much time avoiding the truth, your soulmate finally reached a moment where resistance no longer felt possible. The conversation had already exposed too much. The emotions that surfaced were too clear. The patterns they had been ignoring were too obvious. For the first time in a very long while, they stopped trying to explain away what they felt and simply allowed themselves to observe it honestly. And what they saw changed everything. They realized that the connection had never been as distant as they pretended it was. Even during the periods when they convinced themselves they had moved on, a part of them continued carrying its influence. Certain memories still held meaning. Certain lessons still shaped their perspective. Certain emotions still appeared whenever they reflected deeply enough. The truth was no longer hiding. It was standing directly in front of them, waiting to be acknowledged. What surprised them most was how much clarity arrived the moment they stopped fighting their feelings. For years, they treated those emotions like a problem that needed solving. They searched for logical explanations. They created reasons why the connection should no longer matter. They focused on circumstances, timing, and practical realities. Yet despite all those efforts, they never felt fully at peace. Now they finally understood why. They were trying to solve something that was never a problem in the first place. And listen to this, because this realization felt less like discovering something new and more like remembering something they had always known deep down. The feelings revealed during that conversation did not appear out of nowhere. They had existed quietly beneath the surface for a long time. The conversation simply removed the distractions and defenses that had kept those emotions hidden. Once those defenses disappeared, the truth became impossible to ignore. The truth was simple. The connection mattered, not because it was perfect, not because every question had been answered, not because everything unfolded exactly as they once hoped. It mattered because it changed them. It left an impact that continued shaping their life long after certain moments had passed. It taught lessons they still carried. It awakened parts of themselves they might never have discovered otherwise. As they reflected on this, they began seeing the entire journey differently. Instead of focusing on what was uncertain, they focused on what was undeniable. They could no longer deny the emotional significance. They could no longer deny the influence the connection had on their growth. They could no longer deny how often their thoughts returned to it when they were being completely honest with themselves. Every attempt to minimize its importance now felt disconnected from reality. And listen to this, because another powerful realization soon followed. They understood that admitting the truth did not automatically require action. It did not require dramatic decisions. It did not require immediate answers. It simply required honesty. For so long, they believed acknowledging their feelings would create complications. Instead, it created clarity. The moment they stopped arguing with themselves, they felt lighter. The emotional tension that had been building for years started fading because they were no longer carrying the burden of denial. What made this breakthrough so meaningful was that it allowed them to see themselves more clearly. The conversation acted like a mirror. It reflected not only their feelings about the connection, but also the fears, assumptions, and emotional barriers they had built around those feelings. Once they saw those barriers clearly, they understood how much energy had been spent maintaining them. And they understood that they no longer needed them. For the first time, they admitted what their heart had been trying to tell them all along. The connection was significant. The feelings were real. The impact was lasting. And no amount of avoidance could change those facts. Once that truth was finally spoken, even if only within themselves, everything they had struggled to understand suddenly started making sense. The confusion began disappearing. The inner conflict began easing, and in its place came a sense of emotional clarity they had not felt in a very long time. It was the kind of clarity that only arrives when a person finally stops running from the truth and chooses to face it honestly. And listen to this, because when your soulmate finally stepped away from that conversation and had time to process everything that had been revealed, they realized that something important had changed inside them. The conversation itself may have ended, but its impact continued unfolding long afterward. What started as a simple exchange of words had become a turning point. Not because someone gave them answers they were missing, but because the discussion forced them to confront truths they had spent far too long avoiding. For the first time, they could no longer hide behind distractions, explanations, or carefully constructed stories about why the connection no longer mattered. The truth was now impossible to ignore. What made this realization so powerful was understanding that hidden feelings do not disappear simply because they remain unspoken. They do not lose significance simply because we avoid discussing them. In many cases, they continue shaping our thoughts, decisions, and emotional experiences from behind the scenes. That is exactly what your soulmate began recognizing. The feelings they tried to suppress had been influencing them all along. The connection had continued affecting their perspective even during the times they convinced themselves it was no longer important. As they reflected on everything revealed during that private conversation, they noticed something remarkable. The emotional weight they had been carrying for so long began feeling lighter. Not because the feelings disappeared, but because they were no longer fighting against them. There is a tremendous difference between carrying a truth and carrying the burden of denying a truth. One creates understanding. The other creates conflict. For years they carried the conflict. Now they were finally allowing themselves to carry the understanding. And listen to this, because perhaps the most surprising discovery of all was realizing how much energy had been spent maintaining emotional distance. Every attempt to avoid certain thoughts, every effort to minimize certain feelings, every excuse created to explain away the significance of the connection. All of it required constant effort. The conversation exposed that reality in a way they could no longer overlook. Once they became aware of it, they understood why true peace had always seemed just out of reach. They were trying to force themselves to believe something that never completely aligned with what they felt in their heart. The more they accepted this, the clearer everything became. The connection was not remaining important because they were unable to move forward. It remained important because it had left a lasting mark on their journey. It had shaped their growth. It had taught them valuable lessons. It had helped them understand parts of themselves they might never have discovered otherwise. Those experiences could not simply be erased because they had become part of who they were. As this understanding settled within them, they began seeing the conversation differently. What once seemed like an ordinary discussion now looked like a necessary moment of truth. It arrived at exactly the right time. It created exactly the reflection they needed. It exposed exactly what had been waiting beneath the surface all along. Without that conversation, they might have continued avoiding these realizations indefinitely. Instead, they were finally given the opportunity to see everything clearly, and that is why this conversation changed everything. It was never just about words spoken behind closed doors. It was about honesty. It was about acknowledging emotions that had been hidden for far too long. It was about finally accepting the significance of a connection that continued influencing their life in meaningful ways. Once they stopped resisting that truth, something remarkable happened. The confusion faded, the inner struggle eased. The need to constantly defend their feelings disappeared. Now they understand that the emotions they tried to suppress were never their enemy. They were messengers. They were guiding them toward a deeper understanding of themselves and the connection. And because of that conversation, they can no longer pretend those feelings are insignificant. They finally see them for what they are. A reflection of something meaningful, something transformative, and something that has played an important role in their journey. That realization has given them something they have been searching for far longer than they realized: clarity, acceptance, and the freedom that comes from finally being honest with themselves.